When I was little, my family had a weekend cottage in the mountains not far from Stowe, Vermont. Back then, it was still, to some extent, the back country, and quite unspoiled. Our cottage was surrounded by woods, and there was a gravel road that formed a horseshoe where about 7 or 8 neighboring cottages were. Oftentimes, there was nobody in those cottages, and we were pretty much alone for miles. Needless to say, nighttime was extremely dark. One summer night, we're all sitting around on the orange shag carpeting and watching Star Trek or something, and someone knocks softly at the screen door. It's a woman, wearing a house dress and looking very sweaty and out of breath. I must have been about 7 years old, and had a brother slightly older. My dad talks to her for a little while, as she explains that she needed a lift to the village. My dad, ever the good Samaritan, says sure, no problem. Let me get my keys. They both leave in my dad's Cutlass, leaving my mom, brother, and I sitting still with the screen door open, watching TV on this warm but pitch-black summer night. Meanwhile, my father is driving this woman down to the village, a good 30 minutes each way, and he begins to talk to her and pay closer attention to her. He notices that she is barefoot, and her dress is all torn and muddy. She explains that her husband lives with her in a cabin in the woods, and that they had had a huge fight, and that she has run away through the woods since he intends to kill her. She has lost her shoes in the woods and run through brambles and branches in her panic to escape. Now, my dad is at least 30 minutes from home, and he knows that the first house a murderous guy would encounter as he chased his wife through the woods would be our cottage, where we're all still sitting around, completely oblivious, with every door and window wide open. Cell phones haven't even been dreamt of in this era, and he has no way to reach us. He drives the woman to some friend's house, urges her to call the cops, and motors back to the cottage, wondering if he's going to be greeted by our massacred corpses. It was a different era, I guess, because it never occurred to anyone to call the cops just in case. I still remember him getting home and calmly, icily, locking every door and sitting by the front door, trying not to convey to us how scared he was. That's not even the creepiest part, though. A couple of days later, my brother and I were looking around the outside of the cottage, and we noticed hand and face marks on the back windows where a tallish person had pressed his face against the glass. We also explored the woods over that summer, and actually found the woman's shoes stuck in the mud, as well as their utterly trashed cabin. Someone had absolutely destroyed the place, breaking every glass and picture frame, and throwing all their belongings out into the woods. That was one creepy place. We heard later that the woman had committed suicide. For years afterward, my dad and I would often walk the dog out on the gravel road, and at the turn of the horseshoe that was closest to where these people's cabin was, we always got a really bad feeling. They were long gone, but the hairs would stick up on the back of my neck, and I would always feel watchful and terrified. I always assumed my dad, a calm and rational guy if ever there was one, didn't feel scared. But years later, he confided in me that he always hated that spot and felt very bad vibes, some kind of immense sense of foreboding when we walked by there. This story takes place when I was very young. We had just moved to a new house a bit closer to town. I had my very own room and spent a lot of time in it playing alone and reading in it. Every now and then I would hear what sounded like footsteps or banging coming from below my floorboards. I guessed it was just normal house sounds, maybe pipes, and I got used to it. After a few months of pretty non-stop banging, which no one else could hear, things started to escalate. Heavy furniture started falling down on its own. A solid oak dresser simply toppled over as I was sitting on my bed across the room, reading. A few days later, I was playing with my Teddy Ruxpin doll when it suddenly drained of batteries. I asked my father to put new ones in, only to find that they ran down again almost immediately. We assumed the toy was broken and forgot about it. From the day we arrived in the house, I had known I wasn't alone in that room. I had grown up in isolation and knew what that felt like. This was different. I started responding to the knocking sounds. "Stop it! I'm trying to read." My mother was moderately concerned, but assumed I was just playing with an imaginary friend. A few months later, I had started to experience odd dreams in which I relived very commonplace memories in the house. For example, I remembered in vivid detail walking between the laundry room and my mother's art studio, sliding my little body between the framing. I knew for certain that the framing had been up for some time before they got around to sheetrocking. I asked my mother over breakfast one morning when it was that we'd finished the basement. She looked at me, puzzled, and responded that the basement had in fact always been finished. The banging sounds got louder. Nothing battery-powered would last more than a few minutes in my room, and things were constantly moving around. Small items, diaries, stuffed animals, keepsakes, would rearrange themselves on a near-daily basis. I felt that whatever I was sharing my room with was angry, scared, like the puppy we had adopted years ago. I started speaking to it more, and at this point started to feel strongly that whatever it was I was living with was female. The more I spoke out loud, the less things moved about. I felt a kind of longing, like I had knocked on a door and was waiting to be let in. One night, I woke from sleep inexplicably. I decided to get up to have a drink of water and walked across the hall into the bathroom. Now, I should mention that this house had been built in the 1970s, and that there were many small mirrors, gold-flecked throughout. The bathroom, however, had an entire wall of mirrors that you looked onto as you sat to pee. Bleary-eyed, I shuffled into the bathroom and sat down. Suddenly, my skin turned to goose flesh, and I felt as though cold water had been poured down the back of my neck. I stood up, panicked, only to line my reflection up with a figure standing to face me, a figure that wasn't mine. I tilted my head to the right and to the left. Our reflection did the same. It was me, but it wasn't me. She had shorter hair and slighter features. She wore blue pajamas, where I wore a long sleeping shirt. We regarded each other, and I lifted my hand slowly to wave. She smiled and faded out. I waited for an hour, sat on the bathroom floor waiting for her to reappear. Finally, I crept back to bed, but couldn't sleep. The next morning, I was riding along in the car with my mother and asked, "Do you know who lived in this house before we did?" My mother answered nonchalantly, "The woman who lived here before us was a reporter." I asked, "Did she have a daughter?" My mother tensed. "Why would you ask that?" I didn't answer. "She didn't," my mother went on, "but she was convicted of a crime that involved a little girl." My mother trailed off. She knew that I was a strange child, and I suspect at this moment she realized that in fact my imaginary friend might be something entirely different. "What did they do to her?" I asked, curiously. "Well," my mother began, "the woman who lived here helped her boyfriend to abduct this little girl, and she was never found." I sat quietly for a moment, and then, as my mother reports it, said very slowly, "She never left our house." I watched my mother's knuckles turn white on the steering wheel. I thought I was in trouble. You see, when my parents looked at our new home, they had wondered about the low price. The house had been foreclosed when its previous occupant had been sent to jail. A few families had come to look at it, but in a small and very religious community, people were hesitant to move into a house associated with so much darkness. We were poor, and my parents had 2 children living on top of one another in a cabin with no central heating. They didn't have the luxury of worrying about the stigma of living in a house with a complicated history. A few months later, we moved into a condo on the other side of town. My parents never explained the move to us, as children, but I always suspected that it was because my mother was afraid of my relationship with the girl in my bedroom. In the few months we lived in the house, I had never been able to look in the crawl space, a dark, meter-high area that ran the length of the house. It had clay, dirt floors, and a small light you had to crawl to on all fours. The day we moved our things away, I went down to the basement to say my goodbyes. She had been kept there. I was sure of it. How else would I have had her memories of the basement unfinished? As I turned to walk up the stairs, the light bulb in the crawl space flickered on, swinging just for a second. She was reaching out one more time, telling me where she was, asking me to free her too. I pride myself on my car trip-taking patience. I never rush, I take frequent breaks, and I try to generally enjoy the car trip as much as it is possible. Sometimes this leads to overnight stays in random hotels in Connecticut. My friend's wedding came and went, and I needed to get home as I didn't really know my friend's family all that well, and my daughter, who at the time was 2, was busy being cute. There's a general rule about my kid being cute. I need to be there to see it. Anyway, so I start pulling one of those comical TV driving things where my eyes start to close and I begin driving off the road. As I'm not really anywhere near home, I figure I'll stop at the first hotel I can find. My GPS guides me to a Best Western, but it's all booked up for a biker gang weekend. The next hotel I find is off the beaten path and very quaint. It's late, and I'm so tired I don't really care, so I check in and they hand me a key. A real, made of metal key. That's the kind of place this was. I found my room, unlocked it, walked in, relocked the door, sent a quick text to my wife to let her know I wasn't going to be home until tomorrow afternoon, and then crashed. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, I woke up. I'm not really sure why I woke up, but I found I couldn't get back to sleep. Everything was too quiet. I usually slept at home with a box fan for white noise, but here there was nothing. No air conditioning to hum loudly, no refrigerator to hum, no neon lights to buzz noisily outside my window. The night was still. What's weird is that I never heard footsteps or a car. You'd think with it being so quiet I would have heard something, but all I heard was the sound of a key rattling in the lock. It seemed to take an extraordinary amount of time, so long that I remember clearly having the thought, someone must just have the wrong room. I was just building up the courage to shout when the key clicked. For 3 eternity-like seconds or so, nothing happened. Then the doorknob turned. I'm not sure if the moon was super bright that night, or if I had been tossing and turning so long that the sun had just started to come up, but I could see the outline. It was tall, maybe 6 foot or so. It was wearing a hat, like a baseball cap. Whoever it was had long hair, down to their shoulders. They were thin, but not skinny, and they must have had a quilted vest on or something, because they seemed kind of knobby around the shoulder area. In my head, I've gone over the next 30 seconds 1 trillion times. In my head, I get up and run to the door and shout and raise a scene. I'm brave, and I scare this person off, or at least turn on a light and let them know that they shouldn't be here. I'm courageous in the face of this unexpected intruder. In reality, I lie there. I hold my breath. I don't move a muscle. My eyes feel like they should fall out because I have them opened so wide, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. to have some detail come into focus that will right this so obviously wrong scene. Nothing happens. The figure stands in the doorway. I know it's just my eyes playing tricks on me, but his fingers seem to get longer, then shorter. They aren't moving either, just standing there with arms akimbo, like they're posing for Creepy Stalker magazine. And so we sit there. I'm not sure how long we stay there. Time in situations like this really hammers home that it is a construct of human imagination. There is no measurement here. Lifetimes pass. Finally, the figure clears their throat, an ugly, guttural sound. They turn about and walk away, leaving my door wide open. I spend about 30 minutes of just sitting there, waiting for my heart to calm down, or maybe trying to convince myself that it was a dream, to put enough temporal distance from the event that the edges of unreality creep in. Eventually, I climb slowly from the bed, convinced that a noise is going to alert the figure that I am here, and yes, I am very edible. I grab my bag, creep out to my car, and I drive away as fast as I possibly can. This happened in my junior year of high school. One evening, my mother and stepfather had gone out to some event. Maybe it was an extended dinner or a concert. It's hard to remember. I had stayed at home to work on a paper that was due the next day. I was one of those kids who procrastinated until the last minute and spent the whole night working at the desk in my room. To give you a picture of the room, my desk faces a wall and sits next to a small window that's on the same wall. And from where I sit, my back faces my doorway. While I was working, I was wearing those great headphones that I had gotten for my birthday, the kind that are noise-canceling. My parents left the house around 6 p.m., and the whole time they were gone, I sat at my desk, blasting music through my headphones and writing my essay. Occasionally, I would take breaks and watch the rain and lightning outside my window. We lived in Houston at the time, and there was a big storm that night. I never left my desk. My parents returned about 11 p.m. At some point, late in the evening. I had removed my headphones, so when my parents came home, coincidentally just a few minutes after I had taken off my headphones, I clearly heard the garage door open, and my parents opened the door to the house. Seconds after, I hear them enter. I hear my mother shout my name. "Adrian!" she screams. "What on earth happened in here?" Confused, I get out of my chair and start walking through the house to them. There's only a small hallway that separates my room from the living room. Due to my rush to figure out why my mother was yelling, I paid little attention to the hall and the house. After a few moments, I get to my parents. My mom looks livid. She's pointing at the carpet floor, yelling, "Was this you? Did you have friends over?" I look down. The carpet is ruined. It's covered in muddy footprints. I frantically explain to her that I have no idea how those got here, that I spent the whole night at my desk working on my paper. I watch as her face goes from anger to confusion to fear. We realize that someone else must have entered the house. Quickly, we scan the footprints, trying to make sense of the situation. It only takes us a few moments to figure out where they start. Our back door, which we usually left unlocked. Then we noticed something else. The footprints started at the back door, but there were no footprints exiting the back door. We hear something pounding through our house. We hear the front door get torn open, then slammed shut with a sharp wham. We all run into the garage and lock the door. My mom starts shouting at the police through the phone. "Please come quickly, someone broke into our house." After what seems like hours, the police arrive. An officer stays with us in the garage as his partner goes through the house room by room. His partner tells us that it's safe to go back in, that there's no one in the house. Then she asks us a question. She asks us whose room is down the hall to the left. My parents look at me, and I tell the officer that it's mine. She asks us to follow her down the hall. As we go, it's easy to see that the footprints weave through my house from the back door. They go through the living room, through the small hallway, into my parents' room, which is down the hall to the right, and then turn around towards my room. They stop in my doorway. Then the officer points at my door, which I had left open the whole night. On it, in black Sharpie, was written the following: My log. 8:47. I see you. 8:53. You forgot to lock the back door. 8:59. You seem focused. 9:24. Turn around. 9:47. Look at me. 10:15. Look at me. 10:37. Look at me. 10:49. Look at me. For nearly 2 hours, someone stood in my doorway watching me. To this day, I shudder to think about what would have happened if I had ever turned around and looked at them.